Every time I make a video game, you kind of got to ask yourself, why are you making this video game? What are you trying to say? And what do you want the player to think about? We like to make games that you can play at different depths, like on a surface level, it's just fun to play. And then if you think more about it, there's something to take from it at those different depths. I'm looking for an idea that can support that entire group of players in a way that's great, and building on, what we learned from the previous games and kind of doing what we do best. Every time we make a game, we realize, this was really challenging. This felt really natural. And you kind of start to understand who you are as an artist, but also who we are as a team, and what we do best together. And there's this kind of connection with nature, this kind of spirituality to it, trying to build an experience where it might be possible for players to kind of have a similar experience that I have when I go out and go snowboarding, and which, you can't really describe with words. Snowboarding is the same thing. It's like there's all those layers to it. You can just go fast and it's rad, or you can kind of think about like the significance of being out there on the mountain and why you go out into that dangerous world and why you do this dangerous thing.
So with all that in mind, this one began with a few simple questions. Can we tell a kind of spiritual story in the vein of games like Journey and Abzu, but with a kind of fun and sense of momentum, which was essentially perfected, if you ask me, in The Pathless, and how to reflect that interesting, almost contradiction of moods musically. My main goal here today is to give a sense of how I structured the score. What are the important ingredients that I kind of gradually landed on in order to make the whole thing kind of click together and make sense? Something I'm always trying to avoid is that scores just feel like a parade of notes. It's just, here are ideas. Obviously, having a central theme is helpful, but there's more to it than that. It's how do we organize the music so that things feel like they have a point. They have a kind of sense of trajectory. So let's explore that. Funny story, in the very, very earliest days of the project, Matt sent me this podcast in which this happened.
Let's say if you were to shoot skateboarding, let's say you went to Venice Beach, what would you soundtrack it to?
What comes to mind first and foremost would be Russian Orthodox church choirs.
Yeah.
Something that create this kind of strange feeling of space and sacrality. So what you are doing is special, bordering the sacred.
So of course we laughed, but then I said, actually, we should totally do this, unironically. And after a little bit of iteration, and particularly after some conversations with our fabulously handsome writer, Steve Lerner, zeroed in on the idea that specifically it could be children's choir. Another interesting thing that happened early on was Matt came down to my studio for us to just kind of talk about the game and noodle around in front of my rig. And I have an upright piano here in the studio, and I turned and I just started kind of playing around while he was talking to me. And at one point I improvised a very simple little kind of arpeggio figure. And he kind of pointed and said that should be the heart and soul of the sound. Specifically that kind of sense of energy and also literally the piano. Honestly, it was really insightful because I would never have thought to do that myself. His fixation on the energy level of the piano was spot on because it let us have that sense of momentum without tipping too forward into feeling like a race or some kind of chase scene or something, which the game definitely is not. And the piano was interesting separate from that because this is an instrument I honestly typically avoid if I'm trying to be at all fantastical. It feels too grounded and too realistic in a sense. It makes things feel familiar to our world because piano is such a common instrument. And so it was an interesting kind of juxtaposition to take this very fantastical, almost allegorical feeling world, as all of his games have, and juxtapose it with an instrument like this. Now, of course, it didn't just stop there. It is hardly a naked, raw, upright piano or something. It's a pretty produced sound that may be more accurately referred to as piano-esque, but still, it started with that conversation, and that's where the beginnings of the ingredients began. So bearing in mind this kind of self-contradictory goal of wanting something kind of minimalist and spiritual, but also something fantastical and larger than life, it became clear that the music was likely going to have a kind of minimalistic quality that we would err on the side of the kind of spirituality and save the real fantastical moments for when they really counted. There's something interesting about a game with lots of energy and momentum that's overtly a kind of surfing, snowboarding hybrid game that has a sort of sleight of hand, less is more approach to its music. But there's also a fair amount going on narratively, even if it's suggestive and not necessarily super concrete. As such, a technique I have used a lot over the years that I'm quite fond of is, rather than having a whole kind of treasure trove of discrete motifs or themes, relying on a kind of what I call instrumental symbolism, where certain parts of the color palette have very specific relationships to things you see on screen. So given the centrality of the piano, that became our kind of hero instrument. The piano became what Tina Guo's cello in Journey was, or Kristen Negus' oboe in Abzu. It's the sound of your character, the player themselves. So knowing the piano is going to be sort of omnipresent meant, well, what do we pair this with? For reasons I can't really explain, I also had this inclination that the score should be highly electronic. Very subtle, but nonetheless overtly synthy. I don't have a particularly obvious narrative or environmental or some other kind of justification for this. I just thought it would be an interesting way to kind of sideways slide into the otherworldly, fantastical nature of it. Now, the truth is, electronics have been a core part of everything that I've really ever done, going all the way back to my first project on Flow. But Journey and Abzu in particular are highly electronic. It's just subtle. And so in this case, I said, well, what if I made it a little less subtle? I didn't really want an orchestral score, but I needed some mass, some real kind of bone density, as it were, and thought a real kind of wall of sounds could do just the trick. In particular, I leaned heavily on the sequential Prophet 6 and the age-old Deckard's Dream to create a lot of the sounds, and some were also beautifully crafted by my wonderful assistant Shireen Ghosh, who I sent recordings of things like the children's choir, and she helped transform them into playable virtual instruments of kind of textural pads and things. I also have my wonderful long-running collaborator Joris Hoekstetter, with whom I worked in a similar capacity, creating riffs on some of these sounds that could then be redeployed. At some point, there came discussion of another character, a kind of shadowy figure that seems to be maybe a threat, maybe hunting you in some way, and then ends up being a kind of collaborator and a friend. And most of that relationship is meant to be kind of implied and something that the player might project their own interpretations onto, but we definitely wanted there to be a distinctive quality to it. So enter here, to solve this problem, one of my most cherished long-term collaborators, Kristen Negus, the Field of Reeds woodwind extraordinaire. For the last several years, she and I have been on a perpetual hunt for very novel, very distinctive instruments that she can play and that we can feature in very particular roles. And in this one, we were springboarding off the fact that she had developed a strong interest in drone flutes lately. We'd even taken several trips together going on instrument shopping adventures for her, but the real culmination was the commission and delivery of a custom-made, one-of-a-kind, or it's actually two-of-a-kind, Mayan drone flute that was specifically made for this project and which became that sound of the Wanderer, our kind of mysterious other character. So for my little ace in the hole, I have my absolute wonderful musical brothers in arms of Seathincity, short for Southeast Asian Authenticity, music producers and recording engineers and composers that have formed a little collective, my friend Paroan and Noom Park, who I worked with on a Netflix show called Thai Cave Rescue. They are absolutely fabulous collaborators who, if you ever need to bring in Thai in particular or Southeast Asian in general instrumentation, I can't recommend them more highly. We spent several years working very closely together, and I just couldn't get enough. I really love the vocabulary of traditional Thai music, and I also just love the sound palette of it. And so I thought, for this kind of villain character of Torna Moon, a little thing I would hint throughout the game is an ensemble of Ranat Tum, a kind of Thai equivalent to a marimba that has its own distinct Thai tuning and also color, and like Other mallet percussion can be played with a variety of different mallet hardnesses and whatnot. And so my fantasy was a big group of them separated spatially so we can also create some kind of left-right or back and forward antiphonal effects and things like that. So all throughout the game are little hints until finally at the end you get to hear the percussion ensemble in all of its full glory. So having established the idea that the piano is the player and the Mayan drone flute is the other character, and this kind of very intimate electronic, maybe a couple solo strings here and there, forming the basis of the glue that ties it all together, there was still this question of how to use our Werner Herzog-inspired choir. Well, somewhere along the way, I had met a young composer named Ryan Gunderson who told me he has an ongoing collaboration with a very noteworthy boys choir group called the Phoenix Boys Choir in Arizona, and that if I would ever be interested in recording them, he could help me set it up. And I had that kind of filed away in the back of my mind, so I reached out to him and said, hey, I actually think it could be interesting to use a children's choir on a video game I'm working on. And so several times over the more than 4 years that we were working on the game, I flew out there and did sessions where we would record sometimes little modular bits of music that I could then make into custom playable contact instruments or just move around like little audio Lego blocks within my sequences. Or also, of course, bespoke parts that were pre-written in which they were recording almost like session musicians. This ended up being an absolute godsend for the project and is one of the defining characteristics of it that I just took so much joy in putting together, and the boys were so wonderful. There was even this incredibly charming local Arizona news piece covering them after the game came out, showing them play the game and hearing themselves and seeing their names in the credits, and it was just really special to be a brief little part of their lives in that way. But of course, there's also this narrative aspect of the player being a kind of reanimated statue that has a mysterious past, which is, lost to a kind of amnesiac memory fog, and so you're constantly having to ask yourself and redefine for yourself what is your role in this world. Of course, it's all done very kind of suggestively and poetically and through little hints in the stele throughout the world. But I wanted to make it a little bit clear through the music and a little bit forceful. So to contrast the kind of intrinsic innocence of the boys' choir, a deep baritone and bass men's choir, which I recorded with my wonderful recurring friends, the London Voices and Ben Perry in London at Air Studios. So this was our basic ingredient list. After several years of kind of zeroing in on it, felt really good about this. The piano, the drone flute, this dichotomy between the boys versus the men's choir, the glue in the form of Paul Cartwright playing solo strings, and of course all these different synths I was tracking. And yet, something was missing. I'm a big fan of having an ace in the hole, a sound or a color that you wait till just the right moment and say, aha, here's one last final little surprise. So I went to Matt and our writer Steve, and I said, what do you think of the idea of the game taking on an almost quasi-music video quality at the introduction of each new section, where, using our kind of proprietary language, I write actual vocal melodies with lyrics to kind of narrate literally what's going on. There's suggestions of this kind of thing that happens in both Abzu and the Pathless. In Abzu, the choir text throughout the game draws on the Enuma Elish, which is the foundational inspiration of the whole game. And then there are very subtle kind of musical hints in the Pathless as to the kind of campfire allegorical nature of what's going on there. So I said, let's raise the bar and be a little bit more overt with what we're doing here. And so I entrusted another long-term friend and collaborator, the fabulous singer Maluka, to be the voice of this kind of narration. And despite the fact that it's one of the first things you hear in the game, it was actually the last ingredient to zero in on. Of course, it wouldn't be complete without a little Tina Guo in there, so I did ask Tina to record in a few little places where I just wanted some incidental cello solos. They don't really fit into the big picture structure of the score. But come on, it's Tina Guo, you gotta have her. So there you go, a look at the high-level kind of structuring of the sound palette of The Sword of the Sea. Thanks so much for checking it out, and I hope you enjoyed.